Thank you.
Welcome everybody, and thank you for waiting. Thank you for coming as well in the first place. Today's speaker is the first of two Dorothy Tarrant memorial lectures. We've been having Dorothy Tarrant Fellows here for I think 3 years now, and the field has only got stronger and stronger every time we've advertised it. And so really delighted that Sara Monoson was elected as one of the two speakers, and the other speaker is Margaret Malamud, who is just up here and will be speaking rather later after Easter on a different topic. Dorothy Tarrant is remembered as one of the leading figures of classics in London. At some point, for a different purpose, I had cause to look at all the presidents of the Hellenic and Roman societies and all the presidents of the classical societies, and anybody who had any kind of significant honour at all. And there's about 3 of them are women in each list of about 100 or so. And there's only 2 names that pop up on both lists, the Classical Association and Hellenic Society, and that's Pat Easterling and Dorothy Tarrant. And so we're looking forward to many more coincidences like that in the next century or so, I expect. But it's a nice opportunity to honour her and celebrate her achievement. Sara Monoson is a professor of both political science and of classics, and has been a political scientist at Northwestern for some time now, and also heads up the graduate classics cluster. Do you still do that, or did you escape it while being on leave?
I escaped it being on leave.
And has written very widely on the contemporary reception and relevance of all sorts of Greek philosophy. The most recent piece is Socrates' military service. I've been working on areas around PTSD and the classics, and also written extensively on Plato, and it's on Plato that you're returning to speak today. We're really, really pleased to have you here, Sara. It's been great having you here. We're looking forward very much to your lecture.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg, for a great welcome today, and when I arrived, and to friends in the audience, and thank you especially to Valerie for all her logistical support and moral support, and just really makes the place hum. It's really nice to be here, and I'm here for an extended period of time and looking forward to lots of conversations. I wanted to start by saying something about the namesake of this. This is a photograph of Dorothy Tarrant, whose work, I must admit, years when I was, even though her work was clearly done before, already when I was in graduate school, because it starts in the 20s and goes up until the 50s, early 60s, I didn't really know very much about her, so I took the opportunity to read her work in preparation for today, and in preparation for this fellowship, and actually when I decided to apply for it. And I found her an extremely inspiring figure, as not only as a leading female scholar and somebody who really took it upon herself to try to be an advocate for women in the profession, but also as a Platonist. You'll see on the references that's just a little smattering of some of the things that she's written. But one of the reasons I started with this photograph here is because in a early address that she gave in, I think this was in this was her president's address in 1958 before the Classics Association. She turned to the image of the torch race and the torch bearers that start the setting of the Republic to talk about our responsibility as scholars to the next generation, to hand something down that's light and burning and not flickering and not going out. That's the challenge of a torch race on horseback. But also to see in our sources, especially people like Plato, themselves enacting a certain kind of handing down of material, and she was extremely aware of how much Plato reports of what other people think and are involved with, and how much his own work is a window into not just one mind imagination, but to an entire way of thinking with your own cultural resources and putting them to critical and imaginative new uses. So I want to just read one thing here. She says in that address, she's reflecting in 58 about, says, which is more valuable, to lay the past out for inspection or to actively to relate it to the present? Does not the sincere student and teacher try in his measure to do both? In her measure to do both, I would say. She says the Platonist has double duty. What is to be made of the Republic in relation to present-day ideas and movements? So she's asking that question then, and I think that's a question that we're all always asking now. So, but what I found really interesting was her insistence that the asking this question about how things relate today does not mean failing to take their specificity in their own time super seriously. In fact, what my work on trying to find a theory of resilience in Plato was kind of sparked by a belief that taking our own preoccupations and looking at our own time for what we worry about can sensitize us to certain things that are in the texts, and then direct us to use our scholarly toolbox to try to find those new things in the texts, things that are, as she said, you know, to lay out the past, to try to find it. So, so this is Dorothy Tarrant. Nice photo. Does it enlarge? Yes. You're never sure on your own computer whether it's going to enlarge. All right. So, what is the Republic about? Well, the simple answer is many things. Many things. Typically, you know, what is justice? It's also that's the sort of what is question that people bring to it. But of course, the Republic is full of a wide variety of images and questions and episodes and vivid moments. Think of the city soul analogy, or the allegory of the cave, or the image of the philosopher king, or the ship of state. All of these vivid images, they all they invite kind of deep dives into specific problem areas. You could think of the critique of theater, the critique of mimesis. You could think of the idea of dialectic in the middle books. You can think about gender equality and the discussion of women and property. You could think about private property and its role in trying to build a communal sense. There are many things in the Republic that reward deep dives, and the scholarship is full of that. You can imagine, I'm sure you all, I don't have to instruct this audience in the scholarship. I mean, just the articles on the allegory of the cave probably fill this room. Right? But when we think about the horizontal Republic, it's puzzled commentators for quite some time. There are even very distinguished people who think that, like Dorothy Freda has an interesting article where she says, you know, there's the outline of the Callipolis that we get in, you know, in the first handbooks, and then the rest of the text is kind of like filling out the philosophical underpinnings and the details of this kind of thing. There are many that think that the book does not have an overarching shape. Most translators have found it necessary not only to to offer a translation, but to include little snippets of what's happening in this book in the front of their, even to try to guide readers, because they think it's so meandering and so complex, and things start and stop. Also, things like Cornford actually broke up the traditional 10 books of the that have come down to us arguing that that you have to, as a commentator, find the structure in the text, that it doesn't deliver it. It's not easy to find, but that it's something that has to be represented. And so most studies of the Republic as a whole are exactly that. They're efforts to try to find a doctrine and to try to lay it out and argue that different pieces of it are laid out in different parts of the text, and then to bring pieces from the rest of the corpus in to try to argue for it. So the shape of the text as a whole is something that has whether it hangs together as one anything more than just a meandering conversation that along the way hits upon some really interesting theoretical things that can be pulled together to form, in a represented manner, coherent doctrine, which is what most philosophers do with it. That's the way most people approach it. And one thing that Dorothy Tarrant actually notes in some of her work is that the study of Plato's philosophy is way, way ahead of the study of Plato's kind of literary not just artistry, but as a literary artist, and as she would say, as a dramatist. And she means dramatist in the strictest sense of a author who is trying to represent things done. And in this case, it's conversations had instead of other kinds of plot points. So just to reiterate the extent to which the Republic is thought to encompass many things. This is among my favorite quotes. This is Martin Luther King, and of all places, Playboy magazine. There was a time, maybe some people remember, when people read Playboy for the articles. But this is Alex Haley, the author of Roots, interviewing Martin Luther King, and he said, it's one of my favorite things, if he had to bring one book to a desert island, what would it be? And he says it would be Plato's Republic. And his suggestion here is that that's because whatever you can imagine wanting to think about, he's confident that you would find something in the Republic that would reward your attention. And one of the things that I would like to suggest is that King, with all of the things that he was facing, and this interview was, I think, was in '66 when he goes in the Birmingham jail. Was that '63? I think also that there may be intuitively the long, hard text, not just the content and the deep dives into doctrine, but the conversations that it takes you along and the resilience that it demands of you. I think it's possible that King, in an intuitive way, found that attractive. So, what I would like to do is talk about this is a very unconventional way of looking at the Republic. Actually, that's a really kind of frightening image there, right? So I better introduce that one a little bit better. What I'd like to do is take as a springboard our preoccupation and our understandings today with the notion of resilience. And I'm going to show you a few slides just to remind you of how pervasive and ubiquitous the worry about resilience and the demand for kind of training in resilience and making it a kind of centerpiece of our public life and our psychological well-being. Now, so this is a very unconventional way of looking at Plato, because what I'm going to try to do, and this is a project underway, so this is a report on something that I'm actively thinking about, so be kind. It's not worked out entirely. What I'd like to do is suggest, in a way that I think is reminiscent of the way that Tarrant herself continually looked for images and metaphors and preoccupations that found their expression in the choices that Plato used as a literary artist to try to communicate with his audience about the twists and turns in his conversation, and not just to sort of lay out in a in a technical way adopted. In fact, she points out, as most people know, there is no technical vocabulary. Plato is constantly looking for new ways to express the ideas. So what I'd like to do is suggest that there are ways of finding what, or I'm asking the question, if we remind ourselves of what resilience means to us, can we find images of this in the text? Are there ways in which we can approach the Republic as a place that offers a sort of way of thinking about this psychological challenge that is the capacity to be resilient? So one of the reasons I got interested in this is what things that Greg mentioned, is that I've been working on the record of Socrates' military service, and I wrote not that long ago about Socrates as a warrior and how important that image was to Plato and his portrait of the singularity of Socrates. In the course of that, what I found was that while other people who have worked on many Greek sources have found figures like Achilles and Ajax, and interesting for thinking about post-traumatic stress and for trauma, and I think Socrates seems to be interesting for thinking about the capacity to be to have, like a dunamis, have a capacity to be able to not be as vulnerable or as susceptible to coming, what Jonathan Shea calls in his work on the Iliad, coming undone. So images of resilience. But what do we mean by resilience? So the first place that we find it is in the military is particularly worried about this because they're particularly worried about post-traumatic stress among veterans, and they're I think that that's self-evident. People know what I'm talking about. But resilience training has become a strategy in the armed forces for trying to address what is the epidemic of post-traumatic stress and suicide and all sorts of other difficulties that military personnel, their caregivers, their families, have been stressing. So this is just an example of how these are training resilience training, comprehensive soldier and family fitness, physical, social, family, spiritual, building resilience and enhancing performance. These are programs that they go through, and interestingly, for those of you who know the theater of war and Brian Dory's kind of work with using ancient texts in theatrical environments for audiences of vets and their caregivers, he's actually has contracts with DOD and is part of these resilience training. Is this visible to you? Okay, good. This is from the Mayo Clinic. And just to just see what do we mean by resilience. You can read this behind me. Is it big enough? Okay, good. Then I don't have to read it for you. So these are the kinds of skills. It's I find it just hopefully sort of glanced at it. Here's another one. This is from the American Psychological Society. How do people deal with difficult events that change their life? So what I'm trying to suggest here is that it's not only big traumatic, when we worry about resilience, we worry not only about obvious things like military personnel who face events and adversities that can be obviously traumatic, but expand it more broadly to think about the trials and tribulations of living a life and dealing with all sorts of things as they go. Are you a resilient soul? Are you a resilient person? Or what does it mean to be resilient? What are the tools that you can have for that? I put this up because just to show the extent to which this has captured the imagination. This is a British publication in the political science world, and this is talking about how cities and states are now talking about how they can prepare prepare themselves to be resilient, meaning cope with climate change, cope with the threats of terrorism, cope with crumbling infrastructures, cope with growing crime. It's become a way of talking about public policy, and it's become a way of talking about security studies in the international relations field. How can cities and towns and citizens all have, so this rhetoric of resilience, I think, is something that is interesting. Now, this is what I argue, this is getting back to Socrates now. This is a picture of Socrates. He's the one holding the shield and defending Alcibiades, Potidaea. In some previous work, I argued that Socrates is figured by Plato as a particularly resilient warrior, in that many of the kinds of things that would normally trigger trauma, and that do in the case of the examples of things like Achilles and Ajax, Socrates seems to have the capacity to remain steadfast, but not just remain steadfast, not just endure, but to also be able to sort of come home, pick up where he left off. The beginning of the Charmides is Plato sort of chatting away with young people the minute he's back from the front, and so there's a kind of a resilience. I'm harping on the word resilience because I think the Greek terms that I usually see here, karteria and things like that, usually get translated as endure, cope with, like some kind of a tightening up and and allowing the world to sort of go by you. And I don't think that that's what is going on here. Here's another. This is also the Alcibiades one that I just showed you is number one on the handout. Number two on the handout is this is also Canova, and what I wanted to point out here is that Socrates addresses weeping friends who are not showing resilience, whose inner souls are sort of dissolving, they're collapsing. And the way he addresses them is to also use this language of kauteria, the verb to be quiet, and I said resilient. Most translators say, be quiet and like buck up or something like that. But I think that what I think we see in the Republic, when we turn to that, are ways of right, so where in the Republic do we find images of resilience? I think that what I would like to do is point out some ways in which the members of the Callipolis exhibit. There are ways in which Plato talks about the members of the Callipolis, the members of the ideal city, exhibit resilience. And then also the ways in which the conduct of, I think there's also resilience in the portrait of the conduct and the retelling of the inquiry that makes up the long, meandering, complex, exhausting text. So the images of resilience are there. One way of looking at an image of resilience is to look at the myth of the metals in an out of the ordinary, unconventional kind of way. We all know what it usually is looked at as a way to sort of justify kind of hierarchy, but actually if what you're worried about is training these souls to be able to be, this is the next, so if you take a look at the Callipolis, you have the, I think that the one way of this is a summary that we get. I thought it would be interesting to look at it from the point of view of what are people doing at what ages, and the education and the institutional structures that support the development of resilience among the members. And I want to say of the armed forces because that's the way Plato actually talks about the Callipolis. This is it's the education of what usually are called the guardians that he's concerned about. And that's what the focus of the text is really on, how to train them psychologically and physically in order to be able to handle war, practical affairs, and their own psychological well-being in strong ways. So as children, you get the stories, and of course, the stories are, sorry, I'm just, all of the stories and all of the music are designed to be able to, sorry, we know that the stories are censored. We normally think that the stories are censored because they support people doing inappropriate kinds of behavior. But when we look at the details of these moments, what the stories actually support is grief and worry and things like that sort of getting under your skin. They are supposed to be exposed to, well, all right, I'm just gonna, I think I'm just going to go forward here, sorry. Let me jump forward to, on the handout, the images of resilience in the metals. I think what I was trying to do with this slide was just to show you that in the structure of the institutions, the design is to expose children and adults to as much, not just adversity, but what they are constantly tested for their capacity to be able to perform well and hold up and not come apart. And that's what actually makes them, when you get to the philosopher king at age 50 and above, when they say that they have literally survived war and command, and figuratively all the constant stresses of being tested in all of the different studies and in all of the different practical affairs, these are the ones who are able to then sort of focus on study of the good and be able to go that way. What I thought was interesting to look at it this way was that the entire structure of the Callipolis is designed to be able to constantly test people in study and activity and practical affairs and their judgment and their friendships, and for those testings to be visible to whoever are making decisions about who is then brought into different kinds of studies and who are then given more and more fields of experience, so that the portrait of the Callipolis can be approached as a sort of way to shape resilient grades of resilience among the it's not just intellectual capabilities. It's not. I mean, it's just a kind of, it's an unconventional way of looking at what distinguishes the different characters and the different members of the ideal city. And I thought that to try to make that clearer, we could look at the well-known image of the myth of the metals. What is it inside souls that, so that is normally read, obviously, as a way to justify hierarchy. But if we actually pay attention to the idea of material science and metallurgy and things like that, we can see, if you look at on the handout, Plato offers what I think is a really vibrant image of what resilience is, and he talks about the sinews of your soul, the kind of sinews like the tendons, like a metaphor for physical, but your soul has these, and that these have to be, they have to be able to tense up and relax, and tense up and relax. They have to be able to move, and that in metallurgy, you can heat up metal until you can mold it and use it and mend it and this kind. But if you heat it too much, it will become liquid. It kind of dissolves and loses its shape. And there is this way in which this is the image that Socrates uses to make the distinction between who are the auxiliaries and who turn out to be the guardians. They're the ones who, this image of the metals. And the same thing when he's talking about making the distinction between auxiliaries and the philosophers, he talks about the metallurgy of gold and being able to sort of, working with the material in order to sort of pull it out. So the image here is, I think, one of, can be viewed possibly as a notion of resilience. Other ways in which, so that's the second one, like the figures have to be tested, he says, like gold in the fire. So it's not just some born with a particular capacity. There are tests that they go through fully, and that's what I'm trying to call attention to. Other ways in which we see images of resilience, I think, are in the multiple images of ascents and descents that pepper the text. Mostly in what we especially think about the allegory of the cave and the ascent of the good and the lion. I think that these are well known, and in the capacity to do higher mathematics, and I would recommend Malcolm Schofield's really great article, Metaspeleology, on the description, on the references as a really good way of a really good account of the sort of topography of that, and okay. In book 10, I think I just pointed out a place where Plato clearly identifies the capacity for katria and to have a sort of hesychia in the mind. The same language that was used in the Phaedo passage is the capacity that he finds most important in Book 10 when he's talking about the finest capacities of the soul. So these are just a couple of images there. The other things that I'm trying to track are the images of resilience and the portrait of the conduct and the retelling of the inquiry that makes up the long, meandering, complex, exhausting text. We all know that it starts in Piraeus with a certain bunch of characters, and that that the individual characters drop out after a couple of books, and we only have Glauc and Adeimantus, and occasionally Thrasymachus kind of making a couple of content, so that the notion of the drama in the text is something that's difficult to find in this narrated text. But what I'm trying to track is the way in which a natural, organic conversation that takes all sorts of twists and turns and backtracks and appeals to this analogy and then appeals to that analogy, responds to a confusion raised by one person and an objection raised by another, so that you don't have in the text what philosophers typically try to sort of recreate in it. They typically go back to it and then they try to identify what is the doctrine, what is its logic, where in the text we find it. And what I'd like to say is that there's meaning and something interesting in the way in which the text actually unfolds in specifically these kind of meandering ways. And I think what you get there is a portrait of a resilient mind, flexible, elastic, maybe able to do those contractions and and relaxations, confronting obstacles to the progress of an inquiry. Not necessarily actually just obstacles, but opportunities to see the different kinds of questions and problems, not only as obstacles to the progress of inquiry, but also as opportunities to deepen it, to expand it, to clarify it, to reach more people, to things like that. So one of the things I want to point out is the centrality of the idea of poreia, which gets typically translated as journey in the texts. But it's not a word that just, when we think of a journey, it could be on a train, it can be, whatever, but poreia is a word that involves kind of physically, I think, and those of you who are much more skilled at the Greek, at the entire Greek corpus than I am, but I think it's a word that involves putting your feet on the ground, having a sort of earth, like the physical. There's a text of Aristotle's, Periporeia Zoon. It's like on the progression of animals, and it's really about the different gaits of animals, like three-legged, like four-legged ones, two-legged ones, and it's about the kind of way in which they move in hitting the ground. So I think that there's an interesting way in which the idea of this, something that's typically identified and typically translated as journey, and we all know that the journey is a very powerful metaphor in the entire Republic. What I'd like to zero in on is the fact that this journey is actually taking a path on a road, meeting the obstacles, going through the rough terrain, coming across other people on the way, being frightened along the way, being thrilled along the way. And I think also the important thing about this imagery is that at the Piraeus, where this is taking place, was a place where there were a lot of people, sort of migrants and refugees in the city. It wasn't just the democratic center. It was also a kind of a place where there were a lot of people who were displaced and on the road and in mobile and with an uncertain future kind of milling about. And I would also point you to the work of Benjamin Gray on the importance of exile, not just as a juridical thing or like a punishment that people were sort of exiled and went off, but being exiled and being displaced and on the move and uncertain about how ubiquitous that was really in this particular period during which Plato was writing. And so I would take it that this is one of the contexts that I think is being pulled forward by this adoption of the notion of the conduct of the inquiry is like being on the road. Now, it comes up in the text, I think, and this is on your handout on page 2, it's kind of A and B. This is why I think Cephalus interests Plato so much. In the beginning, why Plato has Cephalus interest Socrates so much. We usually read it as he's an elderly man who claims to be happy, and Socrates is extremely interested in how it is. You say justice is what makes you capable of being happy in old age because you don't have yet death. That seems to trigger the series of definitions of justice that we get across the rest of the text. But also what happens in that moment is that Cephalus kind of says, I'd really like to talk to you, Socrates. And he says, if I were still strong enough to make the journey up to town without difficulty, there would be no need for you to come down here. He says it in passing. It's an opportunity. It's not like Socrates jumps on that. Socrates picks it up and he turns it into an analogy or an image for leading a life. This is B. He says, with pleasure, Cephalus, meaning I'll chat with you, I'll stick around. I love talking to the very old. He says, it's as if, but this is what he picks up. It's as if they're a long way ahead of us on a road, which we are probably going to have to travel. I feel we should learn from them what the road is like, whether it's steep and rough going, gentle and easy. So what's your report on that? This is what we want to know. Now, of course, Cephalus here seems really happy. One context that I haven't seen any commentators actually point out is that, think about the old Solonian adage about, don't count any man happy until he's already gone, because this text is set when clearly his son Polemachus is still alive. So the idea, the grief and loss for his own son and how that might have upended him and ruined whatever the happiness that he claims to have now because of his financial well-being is something that's kind of looming in the text. And it's exactly that kind of meeting those kinds of adversities that I think along the road of life that Plato was kind of plotting here. So we can compare this image of the road with the very end of the text. So just to see that it bookends it, the very last line of the Republic talks about being able to cope. That's not kateria, it's a different, I think, yeah, the Greek is on the second page there. But what's interesting there is capable of being, always keep to this upper way, being on a road, being capable of coping with, look how it says both good and evil. So it's not just adversity, it's this kind of different kind of capacity. And he says that we'll carry on this 1,000-year journey. That's a reference to the myth of air and the sort of, cosmological details that get spun out in Book 10. But the interesting thing is that he recaps the text, I think, there with language about being on the road. And I think that what we do is if we look at two things, and I don't know if I'm going to have time to get through the rest of it, but what I've been tracking is that this imagery of being on the road and the verbs for journeying, walking, making a porea, work out in the text in two ways. They are utilized systematically in the text to depict the members of the Callipolis in their efforts to try to endure the studies and endure the difficulties. The material that was on the earlier slide about what they do in their different ages, that language is kind of very systematically used by Plato to identify the manner in when they are studying dialectic, they're on this kind of road. There are these kinds of things. So the different studies of the different people so we find this language in very places that you would expect it in the text, where the different figures are enduring what is systematically identified in the text as very hard, very painful, very demanding, very demanding a lot of energy, a lot of stamina, not just focus, not to be distracted, kind of work that you do in trying to move through mathematics and dialectic and go through things. But it's also, if you think obviously of the cave analogy and all the extent to which images of roads permeate that. There's the road between the people, the prisoners, and the fire, where all of where the things move back and forth that project fire. There's there's needing to be dragged out of the cave through, that's to be on a road. There's also having to travel the path back down. There's a tremendous amount of language of the pathways for what the figures in the text go. But also, if we step back and we look at the ways in which, and this is what I mean by the dramatic element of the text, the way in which the meandering conversation and it's kind of circling back to points that were made before, and it's recapping of new, or if it's taking a turn or a digression, or it's these parts of the text are typically marked by Plato as being on the right road, taking a turn, taking a periodos, being on the anodos. He talks about hurrying and wanting to rest. This is pervasive in Book 5, especially in the discussions of the most dramatic challenges that Socrates faces in the course of trying to actually sustain the argument, and that is the so-called 3 waves of objections to the, and when he gets to the end of Book 4, and he's kind of given a general idea of what the Callipolis looks like, the beginning there's the part where Adamantus and Polemus, they kind of whisper and say, "Are we going to let him go?" In a minute, I mentioned kind of the community of women. Are we going to let it pass, or are we going to require this to be require him to sort of respond to it? This language is talked about as staying on the road, being there's an affirmation of the use of the soul city analogy, when there's a kind of it's run its course for a while and they recap, and he says, yes, this was the right road to be able to travel, to be able to be on. This is E on the handout. There are many points in these parts where the interlocutors identify whether it would be lazy or do we need to take a rest. I mean, I'm struggling because I know that we have we're coming to the time, but I think in book, especially in Book 5, when they're talking about realizability, and you have this big challenge where Socrates is required by his interlocutors to respond. Not just, they kind of say at one point, let me just grant you that all of this sounds coherent and attractive and all this kind of stuff. How could it actually, come to pass? It's one of the most, I think it's one of the most dramatic from the progress of the argument point of view. I mean, he's still just sitting and talking. I think it's the most important. It's the most important thing, and I should have put them down on. These moments are these are moments where Socrates says he's going to hesitate. He would rather rest. They require him to move forward anyway. There's a lot of give and take in the language of these passages, of kind of being able to actually stay on this road, wanting to go off onto the side, wanting to what becomes interesting is that they persevere, and at one point Socrates actually says, this is in the middle of book 6. He actually says, I'm tired. I'd like to rest. Before I tackle this idea of realizability. He's talked about women guardians, and that he's argued about for their utility, and he's talked about how the Callipolis will conduct war and all of these in a manner that is highly unlike the way war was conducted at its own time, with all sorts of very rules of engagement that we would consider to be, you know, kind of like UN-style rules of engagement, ones that would not produce some of the tremendously horrible things that that were commonplace at the time. So he gets to that point, and he says, you know, I would, and his interlocutors say, you still need to tell us about how it's possible, realizable. I mean, in other words, fill out the rest of the claim with the philosopher king. And he and he says, you know, well, to sort of do that I would like to rest. I would like to not do that, right? But they don't allow it. And at this point, you have the others pushing him to take what's called the long detour, which is going to the sun, lying in the cave. In other words, the long discussion of what it is that the philosophers actually know that actually means that if they were entrusted with political power, which I take to mean military decisions as well as policy matters, that there would be some kind of capacity for bring about these kinds of you know, attractive ideals. As Socrates keeps going along here towards the end of Book 7, what becomes really interesting too is that we have an account of him sort of saying, I'm tired, this is a really massive enterprise that we're undertaking, and that dialectic, this poria that is dialectic, is extremely hard to sustain. And at this point, you get a really stunning moment in the text that always puzzled me. This is the end of Book 7, and at this point, Socrates says, well, you know, if you really want to know how we could realize this thing, what we need to do is throw everybody over the age of 10 out of the city, start with a population of children, and create this culture, you know, from anew, and that would be that would be how we would be able to actually craft this thing somewhere in reality, right? So you can read this and see that what he's identifying is the weight of culture, and how it's extremely hard to undo culture, and that to start with like a tabula rasa, so to speak, to quote Locke, or just with the population of children would mean, you know, that what's also interesting is that passage, which looks like Socrates is trying to put to bed the idea of realizability. And his interlocutors at that moment say, yeah, that sounds like a really good idea. Let's get on now with Book 8 and examining, you know, real life. But so it's puzzling that it happens quickly, rapidly, and that nobody challenges it. However, it's signaled by Plato in this beautiful literature as Socrates suggesting the quickest and easiest way to realize this city is this. And he reiterates several times that it is the quickest and the easiest way. But all through the rest of the text, in the period before that, the language of quick and easy and lazy has been systematically attacked in the books leading up to that. The macrotera way, the longer way, the harder way, the more arduous way, the way that involves more opportunities for deep dives. That's the preferable way. And I think we as readers can see the alternative way to this quick and easy way is the kind of Socratic way of doing the work of challenging and undoing the force of convention and the force of culture on your own psyche and your own sense of what priorities should be. So again, this notion of being on this road, this quick and the language of the road seems to me to be a way of identifying a capacity for resilience. The only thing I'd like to do by way of wrapping up is identify that there are two other passages where this notion of a resilient, this something that stands in opposition to this quick and easy way of just starting with a sense of children, it comes up, and one is at sorry, I was, one is in the middle of book 7, when Glaucon is struggling to help to follow Socrates in understanding how to understand dialectic and how to persevere in this. And he says, he points out, he says, this is at 527C, and he says, you know, it's extremely hard to persevere, because you're going to meet two different kinds of other conversationalists, and this should resonate today. It says that you will meet those who agree with you and will find your ideas extraordinarily convincing, and those who've never become aware of the existence of this instrument of the soul and probably will think you're talking nonsense, since they can see no benefit worth speaking about in these things. So you're going to find these two things. People are quickly, easily convinced, because they like what you're saying, and people that think you're completely, and he says, so make up your mind. This is Socrates talking to Glaucon. Make up your mind here and now. Which group are you talking to? Are you talking to neither group and constructing your own arguments chiefly for your own benefit? And he says, yes, that's what I would choose, to speak and ask and answer mainly for my own benefit. And Socrates says at that point, okay, if that's the case, what we can do is we can retreat a little bit. And the language here is a military. We can retreat a little bit, and we can take some more detours, and we can do work like that. And then at the close of book 9, a very well-known passage again, when Socrates is again identifying the capacity for the Callipolis to exist in reality, and he says, and he's at the point where he has the image of the philosopher, fully formed, and he says, this person is not going to go into politics. I mean, this is Glaucon and Mantus arguing with Socrates. This person won't be prepared to go into politics. But Socrates responds by saying he would be prepared to actually go into politics, but politics meaning politics interior, in an interior sort of psychological kind of way. His project, metaphorically in politics, would be to construct this kind of a city, to found this kind of a city in the soul, so that the way in which the material could be quote unquote realizable then becomes in the conduct of in the results of a long, arduous, but also thrilling and exciting conversational poraya. Thank you for your time.
Sarah, that's been an extraordinary tour de force.
Well,
it's an extraordinary journey, and you started with the torch race and Dorothy Tarrant, and by the end I was thinking about John Bunyan and sort of Pilgrim's Progress and sort of slogging onwards. Would you like to take some questions?
I would love questions. Thank you.
Let's have a few questions and then we will have a drink. Who would like to start?
This is, by the way, just an image of Socrates talking. I put it up here because it's really hard to think about the drama of the text when the drama is somebody narrating a conversation he had yesterday. I went down, and to whom is he narrating the thing? I think that Glaucon passage where he says, what I do is care about myself. But so I put this up here just to sort of show you how, I like this because it's from Chicago, but just how anemic efforts to try to visualize the thrill of a discussion really are, and that one of the things that I'm trying to do here with focusing on this, on the conduct of inquiry as a dramatic unfolding in the text that we can follow to see a portrait of the development of something that is recognizably what we would call resilient. I mean, that's what I'm trying to do. So.
Oh.